All right, good morning, everyone. As mentioned, I'm here today to talk a little bit about how you can stay ahead of the pack, how you can build an app which is going to be successful in what is an increasingly crowded mobile marketplace. And I'm going to do that by way of telling you how to create apps which I think are going to be a little bit more magical. And I'm going to do all of that as an excuse to be able to talk a little bit more about Android 4.4, the latest addition to the Android Sculpture Garden. Now, as the intro said, my name's Reto Meier. I'm the tech lead for the Android developer relations team at Google. And as always, in any of my presentations, there will be some code. Now, out of respect for the early hour of the morning, 8:45 keynote, that's aggressive. I like it. I'm going to keep most of that code until the second half, get a little bit of time for the caffeine to start working through, well, my system, presumably yours as well, so we can pay a little bit more attention. There is a lot of new APIs in Android 4.4. It is just a point release, but that hasn't stopped the number of new APIs and changes being quite significant. So I'm not going to be able to go too deep into anything, but I will give you references to more material that you can find all about the new features and be able to dig in much more depth and much more detail than I can go into during this keynote. And that way you don't just have to listen to me for the next 4 hours going into all of the depth. So I've been involved in Android for a fairly long time, about 5 years I think is the top amount I can put on my resume, which means that I've been there pretty much since the beginning. In fact, this was my first Android device. I'm sure this looks familiar to a few of you. Do we have any other G1 owners, past or present, in the crowd? Yeah, all right, cool. I figured the AnDevCon audience would be full of some old school Android users. So I'm sure this is familiar, even if you never owned one. This is the HTC G1, first Android device, rocking a 3.2-inch HVGA screen, slide-out keyboard, an industrial design that can be described as robust, practical, perhaps. It was a beautiful device at the time. I was really excited about it. But what really made me excited about having this device was the fact that it ran Android, the first version of Android. Now, these days, I'm fortunate enough to be rocking one of these, the Nexus 5, hot on Google Play. I'm sure a bunch of you guys were hitting refresh to try and get one of these as soon as it came out. One of the perks of the job, definitely being able to play with these before they come out. Now, in comparison to the G1, this is a device that I want to own because it's a really nice device. You can see all the specs here. I'm not selling it, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it's got a 5-inch screen, 1080p, full HD, LTE radio, 2 gigs of RAM, all that good stuff. It even lets you make and receive phone calls so you can make it ring during conferences. It's wonderful. I hope it is a Nexus 5 that's ringing. That would be perfectly ironic. Run! Everyone, look at the guy. So more important than these specs is, like I said, it's a device you want to own, right? It's a beautifully designed piece of hardware. Every little detail has been gone into excruciating detail. Oh, there is one right at the front. Nice. Absolutely. Mine has the black cover. Yours is the white one. That's nice. But it's a nice device, right? Like, it comes in the 2 colors. It's got the tactile back. And I get to see a lot of the prototypes as they're building it. And so you can see exactly how much detail they're going into to make these devices that people want to own and touch, have an excuse to take it out of their pocket and take photos or interact with the apps on there. Does the tactile back go around to the sides? What material do we make the buttons on the side out of? They settled on a beautiful ceramic, which is kind of changes color in the different light, and it feels really nice. All of these things have gone into an excruciating detail to make sure that it is something which people want to own and want to touch. And that's something which extends well beyond the hardware. And we can see that in the evolution of the framework and in the evolution of the apps that run on that framework. And the key here is that users have higher expectations. What we would have been satisfied with 5 years ago no longer is good enough. People want something that's much more advanced, and they look at the entire ecosystem as a whole. So it's not good enough to have apps which still look the way that they did 5 years ago. They need to have evolved at the same pace and to the same level that the hardware and the platform which they run on has evolved. So it's fair to say a lot has changed in the last 5 years. And it seems almost out of pace with what you would normally expect. It's only been 5 years. And if you'd had me on stage here 5 years ago, you didn't, unfortunately, this is my first AnDevCon presentation, but shown me what the future was going to hold for Android and said, is that realistic in a 5-year time frame? I would have been pretty skeptical. But it has moved that quickly. And I think it's because in the world of technology, we don't really count time in the same way, or we don't experience time in the same way as normal people. instead of just a simple progression of minutes into hours and days and weeks and months, we're held firmly in the grip of the progression of Moore's law, of the doubling of the number of transistors in an integrated circuit that happens about every 2 years. And it certainly affects the hardware specs, but it turns out that that seems to impact in everything that we do, including the evolution of software. And so I like to think that our perception of time follows the same general rule as Moore's law, and I like to call it Moore's time. So suddenly we're measuring the progress of time exponentially. And you can see the effects everywhere. Like I said, it's not just the hardware, it's the software. You see that there's been, I think, 10 major Android releases, 8 sculptures in the sculpture garden over the course of this 5-year time frame. And the way that the platform looks and behaves in the apps has changed so dramatically. It's even more so than the hardware changes, which we kind of get for free because all of the engineers at Intel and ARM are doing the hard work for us. And so to have a look at what that actually looks like in real terms, I showed you the 2 phones. In terms of software, this is my first Android app. I wrote this in 2007 on the 0.8 beta SDK. We didn't even have a code name, let alone a sculpture in the sculpture garden. You'll see it's a QVGA display, landscape-oriented. It doesn't really look like anything you would expect from an Android app. It does have the map there, and it's kind of got a status bar, but it doesn't really look familiar. So it was about a year after that the first Android, real Android version 1 came out. And I upgraded my app. And this one looks a little bit more familiar, right? It's basically your first Hello World app if you built it prior to Honeycomb. It's sporting what I like to think of as gingerbread orange, just a delightful shade. It's hopefully a little bit more familiar, right? You've got your list view, you've got a bunch of text views, status bar is starting to look more like a status bar, you've got your title bar and everything there. Now, it's been 5 years since that has happened, and as I mentioned, 10 major software releases up to KitKat. And just earlier this month, we launched the latest addition to our sculpture garden, the KitKat, which we're celebrating with KitKats. I should have brought KitKats. That would have been so obvious. I'm glad you guys did. That's what you're thinking. Now, it's still a relatively short period of time. It seems so unlikely. That's 2 major releases a year for the last 5 years. And now, the app's running on the platform. And what users expect from apps is no longer those things I was showing you before. In fact, I was going to put up an app that I wrote, but instead I'm going to go with what people are actually expecting. They're expecting apps which look like this. Right? And this is a pretty dramatic change. We're talking about immersive experiences. We're talking about UIs which mimic real-world objects when you interact with them. The main thing that the Android tried to do when they released Jelly Bean was try and create these richer user experiences, to try and make it feel as though you were acting with a real thing rather than just a representation of it. And so a lot of that was around Project Butter, removing jank, making sure everything was smooth, making sure all of the interactions were pleasant and made people feel good, and never sort of took you out of the moment of interacting with whatever your app was doing. Now, back in the early days, it was really all about speed. Getting to be the first person to market was a viable strategy for being successful. How did you build the most successful horoscope app on Android market back in the day? Well, building the first one was a fairly good approach to doing that. There was so much low-hanging fruit in those early days that all of the things which we could have done on a mobile phone, it's just that they didn't really exist. Smartphones didn't really exist in the way that we needed to be able to build these compelling apps. You could just build them. And if you were the first one, you were able to generate a real audience for your product, and you get that loyalty that goes along with it. Now, when there are several thousand apps on Android market, that's a pretty good strategy. You can do that, and you can get away with that. People will find your app, go, wow, did you know you could get a music player on a mobile phone? That's incredible. And everyone else will download it as well. And the quality isn't as important as the fact that it exists. Well, in the same way that now just having a phone isn't sufficient to be successful in the handset market, it's the same with apps. There are literally millions of apps on Google Play. We've even changed the name of our store. So if you want to stand out, you need to work a lot harder. You can't rely on just releasing something and having a pop-up on what turned into a fire hose of new apps being released every day. You need to do something that takes a little bit more effort, that lives up to the expectations that modern smartphone users have for the apps that they're willing to put on their phones. They have these beautiful phones. They've spent a lot of money on them. Beautiful platform. They're holding our apps to the same standard. Now, to me, success these days comes down to 3 key elements. The first of which is design. I've talked about this already. And it's not just UI here. It's not just about making sure that you follow the guideline and use the right highlights and the right shades of blue, or not anymore. It's really about coming up with a holistic experience, something which people enjoy from start to finish, something where you've really sat down and thought about how are my users going to interact with this app? What are the things that they're trying to achieve? How do I make that 30-second experience optimal? All of the extra work that goes into creating something that does more than just achieving whatever feature came into your mind as a reason for building the app. You want to build something that people want to take the phone out of their pocket in order to interact with, that they have fun with, that they like using. And just like the platform itself, you want to create something that people want to touch. And that's a really big part of user experience these days. It's not just what it looks like, but how does it interact? What happens when you touch the screen? How do you delight your users by making every interaction a positive experience? Now, I think these days as well, it's not enough that the apps just work, or even that they work well. You want them to work well on every device. Now, it was a big step as part of KitKat, a fundamental idea behind the Android framework engineering behind KitKat was this idea of efficiency. And not just efficiency in terms of using less battery, but efficiency in terms of memory usage. Now, the beauty of KitKat is that it will run on devices with as little as 512 megs of RAM. Gigs would be aggressive. So it will run on the resource-constrained devices is the important point here, and that gives us an opportunity. Now, as developers, certainly in my days before I was involved in Android and mobile, I was building native apps for Windows PCs. And you could cheat there, right? As long as you didn't upgrade your PC while you were building the software, by the time it was done and released, all of the computers it would be running on would be that much faster. So as long as it ran on your computer, it was kind of good enough. It would run better on whatever people were actually using. Now, in the smartphone world, we can't quite get away with that same thing. Certainly, the latest and greatest hardware is always going to be better. People tend to keep the same phone for at least a year or two. And there's a lot of people buying phones which are significantly less powered than the ones that we may choose to use ourselves. And this is particularly true in the areas where you have the most opportunity for growth, in the emerging markets, in places where people are more price sensitive. And so they're willing to get devices which are less powerful than the ones that we choose to use. Now, in terms of, as app developers, this represents an opportunity, and that's exactly why Android's been optimized to run on these devices so that we can continue to have the latest and greatest software experience on devices throughout the world without everyone being stuck on KitKat. I mean, on Gingerbread. Stuck on KitKat for now would be good. So that's an opportunity for us, right? We want to make sure that our apps continue to work well on these resource-constrained devices. And the third thing is the one which is, I guess, most familiar to us, right? It's innovation. We want to continue to innovate, continue to create new experiences, take advantage of new APIs, build things which users haven't been able to use before. And this is still, relatively speaking, the low-hanging fruit. It's the least amount of effort compared to some of these other things to be able to create a better experience. And this is where speed to market is still a viable opportunity. We have a whole bunch of new APIs, a whole bunch of new hardware which people can use. Maybe it's not universal yet, but if you can pick it right, you can start using these things before they become ubiquitous. And that will allow users to associate your app with these innovations, and all you have to do is the implementation work. You don't actually have to come up with the innovation yourself. Because it's your apps that run on these devices, that run on these platforms, that people are actually using, and that's where you're building that loyalty to. So when it comes to trying to do things quickly, innovation is still the opportunity that you have to be able to get out ahead of the crowd by just going first, taking that risk and building something before everyone else already has. Now, putting all of this together, it comes down to what I was saying at the beginning, which is that we're trying to create these magical moments. I love this slide. I'll try and use this in every presentation. And what we're talking about when trying to create a magical moment, which is a term that I've stolen from Larry Page because I like it so much, it's trying to make your users feel something, right? You're trying to generate a visceral reaction. You want them to be happy when they use your app, to feel better having used it than they did beforehand. Now, that may seem like a lofty goal if what you're trying to build is a tip calculator, but it's not, right? They're using your app rather than doing the maths in their head, and they want to come out of that having felt good about having done it. about having chosen to use your app to do that. That's how you create real fans for your software, how you generate communities around the things you're doing, how you get people to write blog posts, social media posts, really get that word of mouth out there, give you the 5-star reviews, encourage their friends to use it because they feel really good about having used your app. Now, generating that visceral reaction is non-trivial. You want to create something similar to when you sit down to a great meal or your favorite dessert. It's not just about the experience of having to eat, right? We all have to eat. We could all just, have grown protein with no taste and experience around it, but we don't, right? We like eating. We enjoy lunch. We go out to dinner. We spend a lot of money on expensive restaurants. We pay people like Starbucks to give us our coffee in the morning so that we don't have to do it ourselves. It's the whole experience, the smell, the taste, the sight, the texture, everything about it is something which is far beyond just the simple need to take in calories and sustenance in order to be able to continue to function. It's that first cup of coffee in the morning is that perfect example. You don't need to have a cup of coffee in the morning, but you look forward to it. It's a ritual. For me, it's tea. Others, it's coffee. But it's that first thing, that thing which tells you that the day has started. It's a warm mug. It's the smell of the beans or the tea leaves. We look forward to this. And we talk a lot in software about the toothbrush test. Like you've built something successful and useful if people use it at least once a day. I like to think twice a day, nonetheless. That's the sort of thing we're trying to create. And something like a cup of coffee is a great example of this because there's no need for it, but we enjoy it, we want it. This is the sort of experience that we're trying to create through better user experience, through more innovations, through a more efficient app, is an experience that people want and enjoy. Now, unfortunately, it's not yet possible to incorporate smell, hopefully coming soon, or taste to your apps. But it is possible to generate a really strong reaction from your users. Now, you can go the easy way. It's much easier to generate a negative reaction than it is a positive one. But we want to be willing to take that risk to create something which users really react to. So far, it's not that controversial, right? Like, it's hard to really argue with the idea that improving design, efficiency, and innovation within your applications is going to lead to more success. I hope that's not controversial. Now, you would think that knowing this, that every developer is going to focus on those 3 elements rather than getting to market as quickly as they can. And yet, it's still a surprisingly effective way to get ahead of a lot of your competitors. Why is it then that people skimp on putting in the extra time and effort required to do these things, knowing that that's exactly how we can be more successful? Well, to me, it all goes back to how we perceive time. It's really difficult to understand the flow of time and to estimate things in a world where we're sort of held in sway by Morsian time, especially when we're having to interact backwards and forwards with the real world. I think it's one of the reasons why we're so bad as an industry of estimating how long things will take. We're notoriously bad at being able to do project estimates as to how long a software project is going to take. And I think that's because when we're switching between the two, when we've got our head in code and we're thinking in terms of these exponential times, it doesn't really interact well with the real world and the expectations there. And you can see this in action if you ask someone who's slightly outside of our world with their head a little bit further away from the code, whether that be a product manager or more commonly your spouse, significant other. And they'll say something like, how long is this going to take? How much longer are you going to be? When is this going to be done? And we'll say something like, it'll be like 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes tops. But it's not, because that's in Moore's time, right? And that translates into, it's going to be at least half an hour, right? Best case scenario, probably more like an hour or so. But what we've done is we tend to break things down into as small buckets as possible. We know a full software project is probably going to take about 3 or 4 months. We know this because we've done it before, not because we can estimate it. And we'll break that down into small chunks as possible, into lists of features, lists of bugs, things which we want to do. And all of those things we think are going to take about 5 minutes, which just means somewhere in the realm of about an hour. As soon as we go beyond that, it becomes really, really hard for us to be able to figure out what does that mean. We know it's going to be more than just a trivial amount of time in the next 5/50 minutes. But what do you get when it's beyond that? Well, generally, we tend to move away from specifics, and we'll just say, it's going to take forever. How long is it going to take to refactor that code base? Forever. How long is it going to take to build a real user experience with all of the design groups and the personas and all of that stuff? Yeah, I don't know, forever. It's not something that we can break down into small enough chunks to be able to put into our list. And so what we end up with is anything which is going to take longer than that, we think of forever, but really it just means it's going to take longer than probably the next half hour. Now, as a result, when we're creating our priorities, when we're creating our bug lists, our feature lists, and figuring out what are we going to do, what's the priority, what's the order, we end up with a list of things which we know is going to take a relatively small amount of time. And then another list of things which are less well defined, but we know are going to take longer. And the longer things always go to the bottom of the list, because I'd rather get 10 things done now than like one thing which maybe takes longer than everything else. And you see this. This affects every software project. And so you end up with these incremental improvements. The bugs go down, there's a couple of new features added, and over time these things start to improve. But that breaks down when you start looking over a longer timeline, because those big radical changes never happen. We never bother to refactor the code because, well, the amount of time working around the spaghetti code is incremental to each thing. So yeah, it'll only take me an extra 5 minutes to work around it, whereas I don't have the time to spend to refactor the whole code base. And so when we're talking about things like the 3 topics I've talked about, it's easy to watch a presentation with a guy like me on a stage like this, or me on this stage, and I'm going to tell you to do a bunch of non-trivial stuff, which is going to have an impact, which you're going to need to figure out how that goes into your order of priorities when you need a product that you need to ship. So I'm going to say you need to get designers, build a rich user experience, do case studies, do user studies, build personas, figure out everything about the way it should look, hire people to do the design stuff. None of that is short. Like, I need to figure out the entire, like, how people are going to use this. That's going to take a while. And the same with efficiency. I'm going to say use Google Cloud Messaging instead of doing polling. I'm going to say figure out if it's on a low RAM device and make sure that you're optimizing your memory caching for different device capabilities. And use these new APIs, innovate, build things before anyone else is demanding them. Before there are answers to all of the tricks on Stack Overflow. Be that vanguard. And you're thinking, well, that's great, but that's going to take a long time. Right? That's not something I'm going to be able to do in 5 minutes and knock a few things off my to-do list. I know this is true. I know that some of you are thinking this already. At my I/O presentation this year, I found this out. A good friend of mine from London, Kenton Price of Little Fluffy Toys, he called me out. He sent me this email after my presentation. I was talking about how you could take a home screen widget and add a couple of lines of XML and turn it into a lock screen widget. This is something not everyone had done, and it was, in my words, like a 5-minute job. And he looked at it and went, I don't think it's a 5-minute job. It's going to take a lot longer than that. He used slightly more colorful language than I've used, but I got the meaning. Then in the end, he did the work, and it turned out that it wasn't quite as long as he had suspected, but it was somewhere around that horizon, that 30-minute mark, where he felt like it was going to take a long time. Like, well, it's not a 5-minute job. And so he put it in that bucket of big things, of things which aren't worth doing right now because I can do other stuff that's going to have more impact for less work. And I really think that it's that point. And the exact amount of time, I think, is going to vary depending on individuals and teams and where we are with our projects. But it's definitely end up in these 2 buckets of things which I can do now and things which are going to take a long time, where you really question whether the effort is going to be worth the reward. And that's fundamentally, I think, the trick to how we can get ahead of our competition, knowing that there is a tendency within our industry to focus on those short-term goals, on those things that we can do. Most of the people who we're competing against aren't going to take that extra effort. They're not going to take the risk to do the things which take a longer amount of time. And that's how we can jump ahead. We can start to do those things which other people aren't willing to. And you can see even in the smartphone industry, the way that these platforms have evolved. It's the players which are willing to take that extra step to risk breaking out of the paradigm completely and build things which really didn't exist and which were taking a risk. They're the ones which have become much more successful. While the incremental players, which were still working on that slower time frame, have started to drop off. So if you want to be successful, that's the approach that you want to take. Really good example of this, something a little bit more practical than Kenton's quote. We did the Android Developer Survey just recently, our second survey. And one of the questions that we asked, or I should say one of the pieces of feedback that we got, was that a lot of people are concerned about monetization. How do I make money on my app? How can I be successful in those terms? And there's a general consensus that in-app billing is one of the more successful approaches to doing that, and yet there was a lot of people who expressed concern and weren't using in-app billing. And so we asked, why? Is it because the libraries don't do everything you need to? Perhaps you can't can't do in-app billing in the country that you're living in? And it turned out that almost a third just hadn't gotten around to it yet, which struck me as really interesting. It's like, well, why not? If you want to make money and you know that in-app billing is the way to do it, you just haven't gotten around to it yet? Well, it's a non-trivial thing to do. Now, the actual implementation isn't that bad. In-app billing v2 was admittedly a little rocky. v3 takes a lot of the complexity away so that it is something you can implement fairly quickly. But it's not as simple as just adding a button to your app to implement monetization. You need to figure out a strategy. You need to figure out a way to present it to your users in a way that they improves their experience, that makes them happy with your app and makes them more likely to spend money. All of that takes time. And there's definitely an indication here that a lot of people are just bumping that off the bottom of their priority list because they're intimidated by the amount of time and effort that it's going to take. So I think I've sold that point enough. I'm going to move on now to what I think most of you are probably interested in, which is some of the KitKat features. And I'm going to try and pull it back into the context of this to say why some of these things are important. So I'm going to start with design and some of the opportunities that are represented within KitKat from a design perspective. Now, as we've said, it only takes a few minutes to build something which looks like this. It takes a little bit more effort to build something like this, which users actually want to engage with. These days, it's fair to say users are expecting a lot more from their apps. They want to be enchanted. They want to be delighted and amazed. They want you to make their lives easier. And these are the standards that have now been set. Now, this is taken from the creative vision part of developer.android.com/design, which will tell you all of the expectations that we've done, all of the work that's already been done by the Android team to figure out what it is that smartphone users want, what will make them happy, what will make them pleased to use your app. And we've shared all of that with you. Now, an important point when referring to the guidelines here is that they are not a set of strict rules. One of the favorite things that I hear from members of the design team is that they want to see innovation. They want to see apps which look different from anything they've seen before. So the way they describe this is to deviate with purpose. So look at the guidelines, understand the thinking behind it, and then where you make changes, do them for a reason. Have an understanding behind why you're moving away from what the standard expectation is. And now KitKat actually makes it a little bit easier to do some of these things. So there are a bunch of updates to the Android Design Guide designed to help you create striking, innovative, distinctive apps which allow you to deviate with purpose in ways which are more meaningful. So there's things like immersive full-screen experiences. There's improvements to the way branding is supported to make it easier for you to be able to use colors and custom branding in a way that doesn't conflict with the underlying framework. And that's one of the reasons why you'll see that the blue highlights that were a big part of Holo have now been largely removed. Because in the past, if you wanted to have a red title bar and all of our touch highlights were blue, that looked not great. This has all been changed now so that you're able to create your own custom highlights and your own color schemes that match your branding in a way that gives you much more control, gives you the ability to create much richer, more colorful experiences without having to worry about conflicting with the platform itself. Now, for more details, I'm not really the design expert. Happily, my team now has a couple of design experts, and they've gone through all of the different changes to the Android design guides in a lot of detail on one of our video shows, Android Design in Action. So Roman, Nick, and Adam, who host the show, have gone through that detail. I encourage you to check that out online. I'm going to do a lot of this. I'm going to point you to videos and documentation where people have gone into much more depth than I'm going to be able to in the time I have available today. But I am an engineer, so I'm going to focus on something which is a little bit more practical from my perspective, although very new to me, and that's some of the new APIs that are available in KitKat. Now, I said before, it is just a point release, 0.1, but from a developer perspective, there is a lot of new stuff that we can look at. And again, I'm only going to be able to touch on a few of these, I think, but I'm going to try and give you at least an overview to say what the opportunity is, how you can get started, and point you in the direction to some of the resources we have to be able to find out more. So let's get started with the design side, with the user experience changes. So there's a bunch of new visual APIs, which I've highlighted here. I think one of the most interesting ones is the new fully immersive experience, which you can see here for Google Books. Now, in this new mode, we're able to completely hide the system UI. So all of the Chrome that represents the system, including the status bar and the navigation bar, and they will all stay completely hidden, even when you interact with the screen. So if you're creating something which is a truly immersive experience, something like watching movies or playing games or reading books, where you really don't want to see the time, you don't want to have the navigation, but you still have need to interact with the material, this provides a great alternative. Users can still always get this stuff back. They just swipe from the edge, top or bottom, and that's going to bring that Chrome, the status bar, and the navigation stuff back. But this gives you that ability to have that interaction whenever they don't explicitly choose to get those things back. Can anyone pick the book? Boom. Kit Kat for him. So the way you do this is pretty straightforward, right? So you have two new UI flags, immersive and immersive sticky, which you can use kind of like this. So in this instance, we're being able to toggle between that immersive full screen experience using the immersive flag. So you can just turn it on or off to turn that experience on or off based on what's happening within your application going into or out of a full screen experience. And alternatively, there is the immersive sticky flag, which you use this way. And that's going to create a persistent immersive experience. So this is where even when the UI comes back in, after a little while, it'll fade back out, or if the user hits somewhere in the middle of the screen, it'll automatically bring that back out. And that's the sort of thing that users are going to expect for a game, for example, where they pause, check what the time is, click to continue the game, and you just expect that full screen experience to happen. And you don't need to do any of that manually. It'll do it for you automatically. So this is kind of a summary of where you would use each of these alternatives. So for video players, a full screen with hidden navigation is sufficient, because actually, if someone touches the screen for a video, there's a very good chance that they want to break out of that immersive experience and do something. Otherwise, there's no need to touch it. On the other hand, if you've got a book reader or a magazine, you want to have that toggle between the immersive mode or not. And for things which are basically always supposed to be full screen, games and books, or I should say games and drawing apps where there's a lot of touching on the screen, but you don't ever really want to have the system bars unless the user explicitly asks for them, then you want to use that immersive sticky mode. You can find out more details about exactly how to use all of this stuff. Roman Nurek, our design guru, has created a dev bite on our YouTube channel. It's YouTube/Android developers, which goes into much more detail on all of this. Right, one of the other really nice UI changes that I really appreciate in Android 4.4 is the new Scenes and Transitions framework, which is going to let you help create really dynamic, high-quality, smooth animations within your applications to help transition between different activity layouts. Now, it's pretty common to use animations to help shift user focus between different actions and behavior on the screen, particularly when things change, so that they can keep track of where all the elements are as things are changed. And the new Transitions framework lets you define scenes. So this, for example, would be a scene. It's just a view hierarchy. Now the key here is that if you have two different view hierarchy layouts, as long as the views have the same IDs in each of those layouts, you're able to have the system automatically do a smooth transition from one scene to another scene. It looks a little bit like this. Now, you can have those animations can affect any of the view attributes, including things like size values, opacity, position, basically anything that can change. As long as the IDs of those view elements across the two layouts are consistent, the system will figure out how to move, reshape, resize, and change the look and feel to make that smooth transition. And it does all of that for you. You can actually define your own custom transitions, and you can choose which properties you want to animate. You can specify all of that within your transition definition, but you can get all of the basics for free. This was all written by Mr. Chet Haas, which if you guys have been at AnDevCon before, I'm sure very familiar with this face. He would be here, probably doing this, having kicked me off the stage, but he's in Belgium eating waffles and French fries, as far as I can tell. Priorities, man. Now, in an effort to make Android more accessible, Android 4.4 also includes system-wide preferences for closed captioning. Now, this is a big part of the user experience, is making sure that your experience can be used by everyone who needs to, and that includes people who require closed captioning in order to be able to enjoy video. Users can now set global captioning settings within the user preferences. And if you have an app that uses videos, you can leverage that. Using the captioning manager, you can pull out all of those settings and decide how to show closed captioning within your own app. Now, as a bonus, if your app is already utilizing the video view to do this, then you can take advantage of just passing through a captioning stream in web VTT format along with the video stream that's going to be rendered in the video view, and it will use those global user settings to automatically overlay the closed captioning for you. So it's a really neat trick if you're already using the video view. Again, we have more details from the man himself who put this together. Alan Vivaret actually built the closed captioning implementation and was willing to tell us a little bit more about it. So he's going to go into much more detail as to how you can use these within your own applications. So let's take a look at efficiency. So there are also, like I mentioned before, a big part of KitKat is around trying to make the platform more efficient. I think one of the internal names for this was Project Svelte, cutting down our memory usage, making it a little more lean. And this is kind of the KitKat equivalent to the focus on buttery smoothness that we had in Jelly Bean. Now, I've talked at length in many of my other talks about efficiency in terms of data transfers. I talk about this big cookie model where we want to make sure that we're efficient in how we're transferring data across the network. Instead of lots of little transfers, big transfers using things like Google Cloud Messaging. But I'm not going to bore you with that again, as all of this material has been done to death by me. And really, KitKat is all about memory optimization, much more than data transfers. So in order to try and make sure that the framework was more efficient, the engineering team needed to have a bunch of tools in order to make that easier for them to figure out what they were doing was actually being effective. And happily, they've made these tools available to us as application developers to use as well to make sure that our apps are just as efficient as the platform that they're running on. Now, the first of these tools is a new check to see whether your device is running, or whether your app is running on a memory-constrained device. So is it a 512 meg device or not? And you can do this by checking the isLow-RAM device method on the activity manager, as you can see here. And that will tell you whether or not it is a resource-constrained device. And at that point, you have a few options. So perhaps you've got a feature which just requires a certain amount of RAM, and it simply will not work on those lower power devices. This is your opportunity to then disable that. Better still, you can find a way to be able to modify your implementation so that you're perhaps making a compromise on a slightly different axis. Maybe it takes a little bit longer to do. Maybe you can't edit quite as large photos, whatever it is. Use this switch to be able to find out and modify the behavior so that rather than having to do a compromise that works on all devices, you can split that in half and figure out what compromise can you do for higher end versus the lower end devices. Now, of course, disabling features or even having to cut down on them is kind of a last resort scenario. We'd really prefer to be able to build the same magical experience for all of our users. And so one of the useful things which got put together by Diane Hackborn, one of the key engineers on the Android framework, is this guide, which is on developer.android.com, which will tell you exactly some of the tips that you can use to help make your app more memory efficient in general. Hopefully getting away from the point where you even need to optimize specifically for a particular kind of device. But before you can start improving your app's efficiency, you really need to understand more about how it's currently using its memory, right? So to be able to understand firsthand how that's happening, there's this new ProcStats tool, which helps you analyze your memory resources. And it provides a lot of data about the app's execution durations, the memory use, and all of those sorts of things while they're happening. And so this is a great tool that you can use. You can access it from the shell using ADB shell dump sys ProcStats. And that will give you all of the details that you saw in the previous slide. Now, if, like me, command lines make you a little bit nervous, you can actually get all of this information from a new developer option within the developer options if you figured out how to make developer options appear on your phone, which I hope everyone in this room has. So this is going to help you analyze your app's memory profile on any Android 4.4 device or emulator. So this is a great way of being able to start doing some of that analysis in real time while your app is running. So you can see here it's got a summary of the overall memory situation for the device. And then below that system memory summary, there's a list which has these blue bars which indicate the relative computed memory load of each process and the relative percentage of each time that each of these apps are spent in the background. If you click on any of the apps, it's going to display a summary of the memory consumed, the percentage of the collection interval that this particular app has been running for, as well as the average and maximum RAM usage throughout its lifetime. Now, of course, it's not all about memory usage or memory efficiency, though. KitKat also includes some new ways to innovate. So let's move on to the third topic. Now, innovation is something I feel really passionate about, and I've talked about this earlier on. And really, the idea here is to be able to get ahead of the game, right? I'm in the US now. I used to be in London. Now I'm here. So I'm all about sports metaphors, so like hockey. And people like to describe this as skating to where the puck was, right? It's like you look at your competition, you say, well, that's what everyone else is doing, so that's what I'm going to do too. And the reality, of course, is that while you're busily implementing the same thing that everyone else already has, they're implementing the next thing. They're getting that one step up on you. So if you really want to be successful, if you really want to demonstrate innovation, demonstrate how your app is ahead of the curve, you need to go where you think the future is. Now, there is risk associated with this, right? Like if you're trying to get out ahead of the game, it may turn out that they go in a different direction, but at least you have the opportunity, you have the chance to innovate. And if you move quickly and are willing to take those big bets, the payoffs can be huge. So let's have a look at a couple of the new innovations available in KitKat. So there's a couple of significant ones, particularly around storage, and these are the two that I've got highlighted here. So one is the new storage access framework, and the other is the fully supported SMS content provider. Now, the storage access framework is actually something I think is really cool. I think it's one of the more exciting new APIs available on Android 4.4. It makes it much easier for users to be able to browse and open files within the system. So that's documents, images, anything which can be referred to as a document of some kind. And it can be on the local device, or it can be somewhere else in the cloud. All of it is brought together in a single unified experience for people to be able to open those documents within applications. And in fact, there's even an advanced mode under settings which lets you enable file system browsing beyond what's displayed here. Now, if you develop an app that works with some kind of file or document system, you can integrate with this storage access framework using the create document or open document intents. And when you call those, the system is going to display that standard UI that I displayed earlier, which is going to include content from every available document provider. So straight away, rather than just being dependent on the files that are currently available on the file system and visible to you, you're able to integrate apps from anywhere else. So any other provider who has a way for people to store documents, either on the device in private storage or in the cloud somewhere, you're able to take advantage of that and manipulate those documents within your application without having to build all of the piping and framework to build all of that in. Now, if you want to add a storage provider, so if you're one of these services which people use to store their files and you want to make sure that other apps on Android are able to take advantage of those files, then you implement a new documents provider. Now, there are 4 methods here that you need to override. And they'll allow you to specify how the system is going to browse, read, write any of the data that you're storing, whether it be local or remote. So this is basically the plumbing which is going to go behind that standard UI. Then, having done that, you just need to add the documents provider manifest intent filter and request permission to manage documents as well. And that's going to automatically allow the framework to figure out, oh, this is an app which is able to provide this service, and then use that content provider implementation from earlier on to be able to actually do that interaction. Now, it's a very brief summary for something which is a pretty powerful API, actually not too complicated to install, to set up, but a little bit more complicated than what I was able to share just now. Our very own Lisa Ray has created a dev byte for each of those, so for providing and consuming documents within your applications. So again, check those out for more details. So the second storage API which we've changed is around SMS. So if there's anyone here who's been using undocumented methods to provide an SMS app, your time has come, finally. We now have a real API for being able to do SMS handling. And And so it's an excellent opportunity to check out exactly how you can go about doing those things. Now that primarily involves a properly documented SMS content provider, but also adds a couple of new changes and a couple of restrictions around that as well. So the main thing here is that we've changed the semantics for receiving messages and writing to the provider. So now when a message is received, the system is going to route it directly to the user's default messaging app using the SMS deliver intent. Now, this is a little bit different from how it used to work beforehand. So if you've got an app which is using the prior SMS received intent, you can still use that. So that is still going to allow you to listen for newly incoming SMS messages. But only the default app is going to be able to write things to the SMS provider. But that being said, other apps can continue to read from it. So what that kind of boils down to is that any apps that aren't the current default can continue to send messages. And in this time, if you're using those same intents to send messages using the system, we're going to write those into the content provider on your behalf. So it's really just the default messaging app is just which one is going to be able to display the notification to say a new message has come in at real time. The big change here is that if you're not the default app, you can't write to the database. So in terms of outgoing messages, that's not a problem. We'll do it for you. But in terms of doing things like marking messages as read, suddenly that's something that you need to be the default app to do. So there are a couple of restrictions, but I think overall the payoff of having a real API will hopefully help alleviate that. For more details, you can check out AnDevCon. Again, he's done a nice dev bite on the new SMS APIs, which go into a little bit more detail. And of course, for full details on all of this, developer.android.com has everything you should need to know. So what else have we got in Android 4.4? So there's a bunch of new additions to help your app interact with the real world. And that includes things like new Bluetooth profiles, including, and I'm going to have to read this because it's a little bit new for me too, Bluetooth HID over GATT, which provides apps with low latency links for low power peripheral devices like mice, joysticks, keyboards, those sorts of things. And also a Bluetooth map for nearby device message exchange. And this is primarily for use in cars. And you can go to Wikipedia for a list of cars that support Bluetooth map, which is nice. There's also new platform support for a couple of older technologies, including IR blasters, which is nice. It's a new API that, on supported hardware, lets you check whether the device has an infrared transmitter, query its carrier frequencies, and then send infrared signals if you want to do so. There's also support for new things like NFC host card emulation. And that's actually kind of a cool new API, though limited use case. But it adds support for secure NFC-based transactions for things like payments, loyalty programs, card access, transit passes, all of those sorts of things, by allowing your app to emulate an NFC smart card without having to have a provisioned secure element. And that's kind of the key here. In the past, you needed to have the secure element access to be able to do any of this stuff. And this new API allows you to do that without having to be pre-provisioned by a carrier or manufacturer. It also supports a reader mode so that your app can act as a reader for HCE cards and other NFC-based transactions. Back to the older technologies, there is now native platform support for printing. Along with APIs for managing printing over Wi-Fi or cloud-hosted services such as Google Print, we can also print directly to printers, Wi-Fi-based printers, which have drivers available in Google Play. So you can use these new APIs to add printing capabilities for pretty much any type of content. Anything you can draw to a canvas, you're going to be able to print to a piece of paper as well. Android uses PDF as its primary file print format. So it's really best practice to use some of the helper classes to print bitmaps or to generate a properly paginated PDF, which is my favorite alliteration of the day, for your content, which you can then print out using some of the standard APIs. So there are convenience methods for using native and web view helpers to be able to create those PDFs, to be able to build those canvas implementations. You can find out much more details from one of the newest members of our team, Nazmul Idris, who goes through some of those best practices on how you want to get started using printing for your app. There's also a bunch of new device sensors available on Android. Particularly, we're focusing here on low power sensors, things which can be implemented in hardware wherever possible so that it has much less impact on the overall battery time. There's a couple of new additions which we've done to make that easier. First and foremost is sensor batching. So it's a new optimization that lets you batch up your sensor results so that rather than getting them every time a sensor receives a result, it's particularly useful on hardware. It's going to batch them up and just give them to you every 30 seconds, minute, whatever setting that you choose. So if you have something like a hardware implementation for something like a step counter, this is great because you don't have to maintain a wake lock on your application. The application processor can go to sleep, and a much less power draining sensor chip is able to do the work for you. And that kind of brings in two of the new composite sensors, which are also available on KitKat. So that's step detection and step counting. And they're both on the Nexus 5, implemented in hardware to be able to help with that power consumption. So on devices which support it, that can all be done on the hardware side. Combined with batching makes it much, much more efficient. So for apps like this, like Moves or anything fitness or activity monitoring related, this is a tremendous way to be able to increase that efficiency, make sure that the devices last for longer than the average workout, which is a nice change. So what else have we got that's new? How's the caffeine doing? So there's a completely new implementation of WebView based on Google Chromium, which is really exciting if you're doing anything WebView based on your app. Suddenly, you've got all of the great new features, all of the standard support, performance improvements, and compatibility that come along with the latest version of Chrome, including all the HTML5 features and the new JavaScript V8 engine. All of that stuff is now available within Chrome View on Android, which is tremendous. And that includes live debugging support through Chrome DevTools. So if you are doing any kind of web development work within your apps, this is going to be music to your ears. Chrome DevTools are wonderful, make it much easier to be able to figure out what's happening, improve performance, improve implementation. So you just plug in the device, go to Chrome://inspect within the Chrome view, and it will do all of that for you. So it's that simple, really powerful. There's also new APIs to better support RTL locales, including one of my favorites, which is drawable mirroring and pseudo-locales. So by declaring a drawable as auto-mirroring, the system will just flip it around automatically when the locale switches to RTL. So rather than having to build entirely new assets, which all you do is flip them and put them in your application, the system will do that for you. So you can reduce the size of your APK, make sure that you're not missing anything as well, which is nice. And there's also the new RTL pseudo-locale, which is a new developer option. And that's going to switch the device to an RTL layout for all locales and displays text in the current language. So all you're basically doing is mirroring the UI without having to learn an RTL language, which can be a bit more of a challenge than just hitting a switch. It's also really confusing if someone does it to your phone. So if anyone leaves their phone unattended, this is a great prank. There's also good news for fans of high-performance computation, and frankly, who isn't a fan of high-performance computation? I know I am. There's new performance improvements to RenderScript and the new ability to take advantage of RenderScript from the NDK. So that's the new C++ API, which lets you access the same RenderScript functionality that you're used to from the traditional SDK through the NDK, and that includes things like script intrinsics and custom kernels and other things that RenderScript engineers know more about than I do. Now I'm going to finish off with something which isn't technically a new API, but I think is a really neat new feature of KitKat, specifically from a developer perspective, which is what we are. And that is that you can now record high-quality video without having to root your device. I'm sure a bunch of you have already done that in any case, but this means you can do it with a device that hasn't been rooted. So if you don't like ADB, you can actually do this functionality through the DDMS panel in Eclipse or Android Studio. But the beauty part is that it makes it really simple to do things like this, which was recorded by one of my colleagues. You'll probably see his name as it comes up there. So you'll note that the audio itself isn't captured. So if you want to get the audio as well, you need to plug a line into your computer, record it at the same time, and combine them together. But the idea here really is that it gives you an opportunity to be able to take much better bug reports, to be able to create video that you're going to put on Google Play to be able to help promote your application without having to do things like hold a camera really steady without getting reflections, which was my go-to before this came out. So particularly when you're trying to do things like debugging or advertising, this is a wonderful new feature. So we're coming to the end. I'm sure many of you are happy. The new Android 4.4 SDK is now available for your downloading pleasure. You can get it using the SDK manager as always, same way that you've got in every previous Android release. And you can get all of the details, I'll say again, on all of the new APIs and features from developer.android.com. And we've got videos which cover a lot of that if you prefer to see someone talking about stuff. The fact that you're here indicates that might be the case. On youtube.com/Android developers as well. And so I leave you with these parting thoughts, which harks back to the stuff right at the beginning, which seems so long ago that I can barely remember it. Know that most of your competitors aren't going to be willing to take that time bet. They're going to look at things and they're going to try and find a way to be able to create that list of things that they can do quickly without being willing to make those big bets which take a longer amount of time. That's our opportunity to focus on the longer-term elements of things like a great user experience, of a more efficient app which is going to run on every device, and innovation which lets us get out there ahead of the competition. Our goal, as always, is to create magical moments, and if we do that right, if we put in the effort, if we focus on these three elements and build things that people love, we will hopefully be able to be much more successful. Thank you.